The alarms on my ship had not stopped screaming for 6 hours, and I had stopped listening to them an hour ago. My name is Kalen Dross, and at the time I am speaking of, I commanded a fleet that was losing. Not slowly, not with honor. We were losing the way water loses to a drain, pulled apart piece by piece until nothing familiar remains. I remember gripping the edge of my command console so hard that my knuckles turned pale, watching 3 of my outer ships fall silent on the display, one after another, like candles going out in a closed room. The enemy we faced, a coalition we called the Drenic Compact, did not follow the old rules of engagement that most of the galaxy still respected. They struck first, struck hard, and never gave warning. We were built for a different kind of war, one with formal challenges and measured strength. They were not. I had been told that help was coming, a new species, one barely out of its own solar system, freshly signed into the accord that bound most of known space together. Humans, they were called. I had heard the reports. Young, undisciplined, not yet tested. My superiors sent them to my sector because no one else believed they could do real damage, and no one else wanted to risk a species that mattered on a front that was already lost. I did not expect them to matter. I expected them to die quietly and give me one more excuse to retreat with a clear conscience. 3 of their ships dropped out of the dark without any warning beacon, without any formal announcement, without the courtesies every other species observed before entering a battlefield. My tactical officer, a Velen named Ira Kest, turned to me with wide eyes and said only one word: unannounced. I remember feeling something close to anger. Even in a war for survival, there were rules. You announced yourself. You gave your enemy the dignity of preparation. These humans did neither. Their ships came in low and fast, cutting through debris fields that any sane pilot would have avoided, using the wreckage of dead ships as cover instead of treating it as sacred ground to be left undisturbed. I opened a channel, more out of habit than hope, expecting confusion or fear on the other end. Instead, a voice answered almost instantly, calm in a way that unsettled me more than panic would have. The voice belonged to a woman. She introduced herself simply as Captain Nora Finch, and she asked me exactly one question. She asked where my wounded ships were, not where my strongest ships were, not where my strongest ships were. She asked where the wounded were. I did not understand the question at first. In every war I had known, you protected strength and sacrificed weakness. Wounded ships were left to fall back or be lost, because pulling resources toward them only invited further loss. I gave her the coordinates anyway, uncertain what else to do, and watched as her 3 ships changed course immediately, placing themselves between my crippled vessels and the enemy line. It was not a formation I recognized. It was not elegant. It looked almost careless, 3 small ships spreading thin instead of concentrating their strength. But within minutes, I understood what she had done. She had turned herself into a wall, and behind that wall, my wounded found the space to retreat and repair. The Drenic Compact ships adjusted their approach, confused by a formation with no clear weak point to exploit. I remember Ira whispering beside me, asking what kind of species sends its ships to protect the weak instead of preserving the strong. I had no answer for her. I still did not fully have 1 month later. For a moment, I allowed myself something I had not felt in a long time: hope. It was thin and uncertain, but it was there, and it frightened me almost as much as the battle itself, because hope is a dangerous thing to feel when you have learned to survive without it. The enemy pressed harder, sensing an opportunity in what looked like an unconventional and possibly foolish arrangement. I braced myself to watch 3 unfamiliar ships be destroyed for a lesson in patience that every other species had already learned the hard way. That is not what happened. Instead, the smallest of the 3 human ships, one barely larger than a transport, released a cloud of debris and decoys directly into the enemy's forward line, not to damage them, but to blind their sensors for exactly the amount of time needed. In that gap, the other 2 ships moved, not away from danger as I expected, but directly through the confusion, firing at engine systems rather than hulls, disabling instead of destroying. I had never seen a species choose to disable an enemy rather than destroy it, not in the middle of active combat, not when destruction was faster and safer. Ira asked me if it was some kind of mercy. I did not think it was mercy at all. I thought, and I still believe, that it was calculation. A disabled enemy could not immediately retaliate, but it also did not require the same commitment of firepower that destruction did. It was efficient in a way that had nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with control. The Drennick ships, disabled and drifting, broke formation. Without their coordinated strength, the rest of their assault began to falter, and for the first time in 6 hours, my own ships found room to breathe. I sat in my command chair and said nothing for a long moment. Around me, my crew exchanged glances, uncertain whether to celebrate or remain wary. I understood their hesitation, because I felt it too. We had been saved, but we had been saved by something none of us understood, something that did not fight the way we had been taught war should be fought. When the channel opened again, Captain Finch's voice returned, still calm, still steady, as though she had not just rewritten the shape of the battle in a matter of minutes. She asked if my ships could hold position long enough to complete repairs. I told her yes. She said good, and then she said something I would remember for the rest of my life. She said that they had not come to win the battle for us. They had come to make sure we survived long enough to win it ourselves. I did not know, in that moment, that I was listening to the first sentence of a story the entire galaxy would eventually learn by heart. I only knew that something had changed in the sky above my dying fleet, and that whatever it was not finished. As the enemy withdrew to regroup, I looked at the 3 human ships holding their strange, thin formation, undamaged, patient, and utterly unlike anything I had fought beside before. I remember thinking that we had asked for reinforcements and received something else entirely. We had received a warning, quiet and unspoken, about what the rest of this war was about to become. The days that followed the first encounter felt unreal to me, the way calm water feels unreal after a storm you were certain would drown you. My fleet had survived, but survival alone did not explain the silence that settled over my crew whenever the humans were mentioned. It was not fear exactly. It was something closer to disbelief, the same disbelief you feel when a story you were told as a warning turns out to be smaller and stranger than the truth. I requested a formal briefing with Captain Finch 2 days after the battle, expecting the kind of exchange I was used to among Allied commanders, a careful trading of strategy wrapped in diplomatic language, each side revealing only what it needed to. What I received instead was a woman who spoke plainly, without ceremony, and who seemed almost impatient with the formalities I offered. She told me her small formation had not been the main human force at all. It was a scouting and support unit, sent ahead because the larger human contingent was still coordinating with a Accord command. I remember asking her, carefully, why a scouting unit had engaged a hostile force nearly 10 times its size, instead of withdrawing to report. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and her answer has stayed with me since. She said that by the time they finished reporting, we would already be dead. There was no pride in the way she said it, no attempt to impress me. It was simply a fact, stated the way one might describe the weather. I began to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that the humans did not see delay as a neutral choice. To them, waiting for permission while others were dying was itself a decision, and not one they were willing to make. 3 weeks later, the larger human force arrived, and with it came the battle that would change how I understood war entirely. The Drennick Compact had regrouped along a supply corridor vital to both our fleets, a narrow stretch of space bordered by a dense asteroid field on one side and a dead moon on the other. Every commander I had ever served under would have called it a difficult position, one to be approached with caution and heavy losses expected. The Compact clearly believed the same, because they had reinforced the corridor with 3 times the numbers we had originally faced. I was present at the coordination briefing, where the joint attack was planned, representing my fleet alongside commanders from 4 other Allied species. It was there that I first met the human officer who would lead the assault, a man named Owen Hale. He was younger than I expected, though I was learning quickly that human age meant little in judging their capability. He did not raise his voice once during that meeting, yet every other commander in the room found themselves leaning forward to hear him. His plan was met with open resistance at first. He proposed sending a small group of ships directly into the asteroid field, the very obstacle every other strategist in the room considered impassable, while the main force approached the corridor from the opposite direction as a visible distraction. The Velen commander, a cautious and experienced officer named Threll Osan, objected immediately, calling it reckless beyond reason. Owen listened to every objection without interruption, and when Threll finished speaking, he asked a single question in return. He asked what the compact would expect us to do. The room went quiet. The answer, uncomfortable as it was that no sane commander would send ships into an asteroid field under active combat conditions. That was precisely his point. The compact would not expect it, because it was not a rational choice by any standard we had been trained to follow. Owen did not deny the danger. He simply argued that the danger was smaller than the danger of doing what the enemy expected. I voted in favor of the plan, not because I fully trusted it, but because I had already watched 3 human ships hold a line no one else believed could be held. Threll voted against it, and made his objection part of the official record, a decision I did not blame him for at the time. The battle began at what the humans called dawn, though there was no true dawn in open space, only the artificial marking of time that made coordination possible across different ships and different species. I watched from my own vessel as the main Allied fleet advanced toward the corridor exactly as planned, drawing the full attention of the compact's forces. For the first several minutes, nothing seemed unusual. The compact ships moved to intercept, confident in their numbers, exactly as Owen had predicted. Then the asteroid field, which every sensor had marked as empty and impassable, began to move. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. The human ships had not simply flown through the asteroid field. They had used it, guiding themselves along paths calculated with a precision that seemed impossible given how quickly the plan had been assembled. Small charges, placed with careful timing rather than raw force, shifted sections of the field just enough to create openings that closed again seconds later, hiding their approach from compact sensors until the ships were already inside the enemy formation. I remember Ira beside me, forgetting protocol entirely and simply saying that it was not possible. I did not correct her, because in that moment I did not believe it either, even as I watched it unfold on my own display. The compact fleet, caught between the visible threat of the main Allied force and the sudden, invisible threat emerging from within their own formation, began to fracture. Their command structure, built for orderly, formal combat, had no answer for an enemy that had turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. Owen's voice came over the shared channel during the height of the engagement, steady as it had been in the briefing room. He gave no dramatic speeches, no declarations of victory. He simply issued coordinates, adjustments, and warnings, guiding both human and Allied ships through a battle that no longer resembled the plan we had voted on, because he was adapting it in real time to what the enemy was actually doing rather than what we had assumed they would do. I saw Allied ships, including my own, begin to follow his instructions instead of our original formation, not because of any formal chain of command, but because his adjustments were simply working. Threll, who had voted against the plan only hours earlier, was among the first to fall into step with the new instructions, and I do not think he even noticed the moment he did it. The battle lasted less than 2 hours, remarkably short by the standards of that war. The compact forces, unable to reorganize fast enough to counter a strategy built entirely around unpredictability, withdrew from the corridor entirely, abandoning a position they had held for months. It was not simply a victory, it was a collapse. In the aftermath, as damaged ships began the slow process of regrouping and repair, I found myself replaying the battle again and again in my mind, searching for the moment I could point to and say, "This is where they broke the old rules." I could not find a single moment. The entire engagement had been built from the ground up around ideas none of us had considered acceptable only hours before. I requested a private channel with Owen once the corridor was secured, and when his face appeared on my display, he looked tired in a way that surprised me, not with the exhaustion of victory, but with something closer to relief. I asked him directly how he had known the plan would work, given how quickly it had been developed and how strongly it had been opposed. He told me he had not known. He said that in his experience, certainty was a luxury that got people killed while they waited for it. What he had known, he said, was that doing nothing while the compact solidified its position would guarantee failure, while an uncertain plan at least gave us a chance. I asked him if that uncertainty ever troubled him, and he admitted, quietly, that it did, every time. It was the first moment I saw something in him that felt familiar, a discomfort with risk that I recognized in myself, buried beneath a willingness to act despite it. I began to understand, slowly, that the humans were not fearless. They were simply unwilling to let fear make their decisions for them, and that distinction, small as it seemed, was the foundation of everything that followed. News of the corridor battle spread quickly through the Allied fleets, carried not through official reports at first, but through the kind of informal channels that move faster than any command structure. I heard it described in a dozen different ways within days, each version stranger than the last, but the core of it remained the same in every telling. A single human officer had turned an impassable obstacle into a hidden weapon, and in doing so had broken a siege that seasoned commanders believed could not be broken for months to come. I did not yet understand that this was only the beginning. I did not yet understand that the humans were not simply skilled at war. They were something closer to a mirror, reflecting back every assumption the rest of us had made about how war was supposed to be fought, and showing us, piece by piece, how many of those assumptions had never truly served us at all. What I understood, sitting alone in my quarters that night, replaying Owen's calm voice guiding ships through chaos he had created on purpose, was simpler and far more unsettling. We had asked the galaxy's newest species to help us survive a war we were losing. Instead, they had begun, quietly and without any apparent awareness of what they were doing, to teach the rest of us how to win one. The weeks after the corridor battle brought a kind of attention to the human forces that I do not think they expected or particularly wanted. Allied command requested detailed reports on their tactics. Other species sent observers to study their methods, and I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, assigned as a liaison officer to Owen Hale's unit for an extended period. I was told this was an honor. I suspect it was also an attempt to keep a watchful eye on something no one fully understood yet. I arrived aboard the human vessel, expecting the same calm precision I had witnessed in battle to extend into every part of their daily life. What I found instead was far more complicated and far more human, in ways I had not anticipated. The ship itself was smaller than I expected for a command vessel, cramped in places where Allied ships of similar rank allowed for open space and formal quarters. I later learned this was deliberate. Owen explained, almost apologetically, that a smaller ship moved faster and repaired easier, and that comfort was a resource they had chosen to spend on speed instead. I met the rest of his core team within my first day aboard, and each of them left an impression that reshaped, in some small way, my understanding of what humans were. There was Daniel Voss, the ship's engineer, a quiet man who spoke rarely, but whose hands seemed to be in constant motion, adjusting, repairing, improving systems that already worked, simply because he believed they could work better. I watched him once spend 3 uninterrupted hours recalibrating a shield system that had performed adequately in the corridor battle, muttering the entire time about margins that were too thin for his comfort, even though no one had asked him to change anything at all. There was Ellie Marsh, their communications officer, whose voice I had heard countless times over shared channels without ever attaching a face to it. She had a habit of translating tension into something almost lighthearted in the moments between danger, not to diminish the seriousness of what they faced, but, as she explained to me once, because a crew that could not laugh together eventually stopped trusting each other entirely. I did not fully understand this at first. I came to understand it very well later. And there was Lucas Bren, young, sharp, and openly curious about every species aboard the Allied fleet, myself included. He asked me questions I had never been asked before, not about our tactics or our technology, but about how Ostari mourned our dead, how we celebrated survival, what fear felt like to a species that lived far longer than his own typically did. I found myself answering honestly, more honestly than I had answered questions from officers I had served alongside for years. It was Nora Finch, however, who I found myself watching most closely, the same officer whose calm voice had guided 3 ships to hold a line no one believed could be held. Aboard the ship, away from active combat, she carried a different kind of weight, one I recognized because I carried a version of it myself. She was their chief medical officer, as well as a combat commander, a dual role that seemed, to me, an impossible burden to place on a single person. I asked her once, during a quiet stretch between assignments, how she managed to hold both responsibilities without one destroying the other. She told me that she did not always manage it well. She told me about a battle before I had ever met her unit, one where the tactical decision that saved the most lives overall had cost the life of a soldier she had personally treated only hours earlier, a young man whose name she still remembered clearly enough to say aloud without hesitation. I asked her how she carried that. She said she did not carry it alone, and that this, more than any tactic or weapon, was the true difference between how humans approached war and how many other species did. She said humans had learned, often at great cost, that isolation in the face of loss was more dangerous than the loss itself, and that every decision her unit made was built on the understanding that no single person should have to bear the weight of impossible choices without others beside them. I began to see this principle reflected everywhere aboard the ship, not as a formal policy, but as something woven into how they simply existed together. Meals were rarely eaten alone. Difficult decisions were discussed openly, sometimes loudly, before ever being finalized. Even Owen, who held ultimate command, made a visible practice of asking every member of his core team for their assessment before major engagements, not as a courtesy, but because he genuinely seemed to believe that any one of them might see something he had missed. This was tested directly during a joint operation roughly 2 months into my assignment, one that would prove far more difficult than the corridor battle had been, and far more costly. Allied intelligence had identified a compact staging point deep within contested territory, a location believed to house a significant portion of their remaining fleet reserves. Striking it successfully could shorten the war considerably. Failing to strike it, or striking it poorly, risked exposing a significant portion of Allied forces to a devastating counterattack. The operation required coordination between 5 separate fleets, including my own and Owen's unit, and it was during the planning phase that I witnessed something I had not yet seen from the humans, something closer to open disagreement among themselves. Daniel argued strongly against a proposed approach vector, citing concerns about shield degradation over the extended travel time required. Ellie countered that a slower approach risked detection long before any engagement began, potentially costing more lives through discovery than the shield concerns Daniel raised. The debate grew heated enough that, for a moment, I expected Owen to simply issue an order and end the discussion, the way I would have expected of most commanders I had served under. He did not. He let the disagreement continue, asking pointed questions of both sides, until eventually a compromise emerged that neither had proposed individually, a staggered approach that addressed both concerns imperfectly but adequately. I asked him afterward why he had not simply decided the matter himself from the start, given that the final authority rested with him regardless. He told me that the best plans he had ever been part of rarely came from a single mind alone, and that his job as commander was not always to have the right answer immediately, but to create the conditions where the right answer could be found, even if that meant tolerating disagreement longer than felt comfortable. The operation itself unfolded with a level of tension I had not experienced since the corridor battle, and in some ways exceeded it. The staggered approach worked as intended, but partway through the engagement, a compact reserve force that intelligence had failed to identify emerged from a concealed position, threatening to cut off Nora's forward medical and support ships from the rest of the fleet entirely. I watched from my own vessel as the situation began to unravel in ways the plan had not accounted for. Allied command, myself included, began recommending a partial withdrawal to preserve the main strike force, accepting the loss of the forward ships as a necessary cost. It was, by every standard I had been trained to apply, the correct decision. Owen refused. He redirected 2 of his own primary combat ships away from the main assault, moving to reinforce Nora's position instead, a decision that reduced the strike force's overall effectiveness at the exact moment its full strength was needed most. I remember arguing with him directly over the shared channel, telling him that the mission's success mattered more than the ships he was pulling back, that this was the calculation every commander eventually had to make. His response was brief, and I believe, entirely sincere. He said that a mission built on abandoning people the moment they became inconvenient to save was not a mission worth completing in the first place, and that if the operation could not succeed while also protecting Nora's ships, then the operation itself needed to change, not the value they placed on the people carrying it out. I did not agree with him in that moment. I believed, based on everything I had ever learned about warfare, that he was making a mistake that could cost the entire operation its success. I was wrong. The reinforcement arrived in time to stabilize Nora's position, and more importantly, the act of holding that line disrupted the compact reserve force's momentum long enough for the main strike force, now operating with reduced numbers but renewed determination from every Allied ship watching what had just happened, to press forward with an intensity I had not seen from our combined fleets before. The staging point fell within the hour, its remaining forces scattering rather than risk continued engagement against forces that had just demonstrated they would not simply abandon their own the moment the cost grew high. In the aftermath, I sat with Owen in the quiet of his ship's command deck, neither of us speaking for a long while. I eventually asked him if he had known, truly known, that his decision would not cost them the entire operation. He told me the truth, without hesitation. He had not known. He had simply decided that some risks were worth taking regardless of the odds, because the alternative, becoming a force that calculated the value of its own people against the value of a mission, was a version of victory he was not willing to accept, even if it meant losing. I thought, in that moment, of everything I had witnessed since the first human ships had appeared above my dying fleet. I thought of the wall Nora had formed with 3 ships against overwhelming odds, of the asteroid field turned into a weapon by a man unwilling to accept defeat as inevitable, of an engineer who improved systems no one asked him to touch simply because he believed they deserved to be better, of a communications officer who understood that laughter and trust were inseparable in the long run. I began to understand, slowly and with growing certainty, that what made the humans dangerous on the battlefield was inseparable from what made them, in the quiet moments between battles, something closer to remarkable. They did not fight well despite their attachment to one another. They fought well because of it, and every allied species watching them, myself included, was beginning to learn that the old assumptions about strength and sacrifice, the ones we had built entire strategies around for generations, had never truly served us as well as we believed they had. The war was far from over, but something in how it was being fought had already begun to change, quietly, permanently, and it had started the moment 3 unfamiliar ships refused to leave anyone behind. The operation that followed months later would come to be known, across nearly every allied species, simply as the turning point, though at the time none of us understood we were living through something history would later name so plainly. I was present for all of it, and even now, recounting it, I find myself searching for the exact moment everything shifted, the same way I had searched after the corridor battle, only to realize once again that there was no single moment, There was only a long, difficult unraveling of everything we thought we understood about how this war could be won. The Compact had spent the months following their staging point defeat, consolidating their remaining forces around a heavily fortified position they called the Hollow, a natural formation deep within a dense debris belt that had, over centuries of conflict, become nearly impossible to approach without catastrophic losses. Every Allied strategist who studied it agreed on one point without exception. A direct assault on the Hollow would fail, regardless of how many ships or how much strength was brought against it. Allied command convened a war council to discuss alternatives, and I attended as senior liaison to the human forces, a role that had, by that point, become something closer to a genuine partnership than a formal assignment. The council was larger than any I had previously attended. Representatives from 11 different species gathered to determine whether the war could continue at all, if the Hollow remained unbreakable. It was during this council that I watched the alliance itself nearly fracture, not because of disagreement over strategy alone, but because of a deeper divide in philosophy that the humans had, without ever intending to, brought sharply into focus. Threll-Osan, who had grown into one of the more vocal supporters of human tactics since the Corridor battle, proposed a plan that leaned heavily on the kind of unconventional thinking the humans had introduced. Several other commanders, however, including representatives from species that had fought this war far longer than either the Velen or the humans, argued strongly against further departure from established doctrine, citing the very real losses such approaches had already cost, even in victory. I remember a Krath commander named Ves Orelin standing to speak, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone who had buried more soldiers than he cared to count over the course of a war that predated most of the room's memory. He did not dismiss the human contributions. He acknowledged them plainly, but he argued that unpredictability, however effective, could not be sustained indefinitely without eventually collapsing under its own uncertainty, and that a war built entirely on improvisation was a war with no foundation at all. It was Owen who answered him, and I remember his response clearly, because it was the first time I heard him speak not as a tactician, but as something closer to a philosopher of his own species' approach to conflict. He agreed with Ves. He said that improvisation without foundation was indeed reckless, and that if that was truly what the humans had been doing, Ves would be right to distrust it entirely. But he argued that what looked like improvisation from the outside was, in fact, built on a foundation, just not the one most species in the room had been trained to recognize. The foundation, he said, was not a fixed set of tactics or formations. It was trust, built person by person, decision by decision, tested and confirmed long before any battle began, so that when circumstances changed unpredictably, as they always eventually did, the people involved could adapt together without that trust breaking apart. Ves did not fully accept this argument in that moment, and I do not blame him. It was a difficult idea to accept for species that had built centuries of doctrine around discipline and predictability as the only reliable safeguards against chaos. But the Council eventually agreed, out of necessity more than full conviction, to allow a joint operation against the Hollow built around human-led coordination, with the understanding that if it failed, the alliance would return to more conventional, cautious strategies, even if that meant accepting a longer, costlier war. The plan that emerged over the following weeks was unlike anything I had been part of before, and unlike anything the humans themselves had attempted, at least in scale. Rather than a single unified assault, the operation was built around dozens of smaller, independent units, human and allied ships mixed together deliberately, each given significant autonomy to adapt to conditions as they encountered them, rather than waiting for centralized command to issue instructions for every development. I was assigned to one such unit alongside Ellie and a small contingent of Velen ships, a pairing that initially unsettled the Velen commander assigned to work with us, given how unfamiliar this structure was to him. I remember Ellie spending the days before the operation not drilling tactics with him, as I expected, but simply talking with him, learning how he communicated stress, how his crew responded to sudden changes, building the kind of familiarity that would allow real coordination once the fighting began, rather than relying on formal protocols alone. The operation began without the announcement or ceremony that had once defined how such battles were fought. Small units entered the debris belt from dozens of directions simultaneously, each adapting their approach based on what they encountered, communicating constantly with neighboring units rather than waiting for centralized instruction. It was, from a distance, a scene of apparent chaos, ships moving in patterns that seemed to follow no unified logic at all. Yet within that apparent chaos, something remarkable began to happen. The compact's defenses, built around anticipating coordinated, predictable assault patterns, found themselves unable to respond effectively to dozens of independent, adaptive units, each capable of reacting to unexpected developments without waiting for permission from a central authority that, in previous engagements, had always eventually created the delay the enemy needed to reposition and counter. I found myself, alongside Ellie and our Velen counterparts, cut off from the broader operation roughly an hour into the engagement, a compact defensive cluster positioning itself between our small unit and the rest of the Allied force. In any previous operation, this would have meant waiting for reinforcement, reporting our position, and hoping command could redirect support in time. Ellie did not wait. She opened a direct channel not to Central Command, but to the nearest Allied unit she could identify, a human vessel commanded by a woman I had not yet met, and within minutes, a coordinated response had been organized entirely between the units themselves, without ever routing through the kind of centralized approval that would have cost precious time. The Velen commander beside me watched this unfold with an expression I recognized immediately, the same disbelief I had felt during the corridor battle months earlier. We broke free of the defensive cluster within 20 minutes, a result that, under previous doctrine, would have taken hours to achieve through proper channels, if it had been achieved at all. Across the entire debris belt, similar scenes were unfolding in dozens of locations simultaneously, small units adapting, coordinating directly with one another, overwhelming a defense built to counter a single unified threat rather than dozens of independent, cooperative ones. The Hollow's command structure, I learned later, began issuing contradictory orders within the first 2 hours, unable to process the sheer volume of unpredictable, decentralized engagements happening across their entire perimeter at once. Owen's own unit led the final push toward the Hollow's core, and it was there that the operation faced its most difficult moment. A compact commander, recognizing that conventional defense had failed entirely, made a desperate final decision, redirecting the Hollow's remaining defensive systems toward a joint civilian evacuation route that several Allied species, including a significant number of Velen refugees, had been using throughout the operation to move non-combatants out of the debris belt entirely. I heard the moment this happened over the shared operational channel, a Velen officer's voice cracking as she reported the evacuation route under direct threat, with no combat forces positioned close enough to intervene in time through conventional means. What followed was, I believe, the single moment that came to define how the rest of the galaxy would eventually remember this operation, and perhaps the entire war. Owen redirected his own command vessel, along with every ship close enough to follow, directly into the path of the incoming defensive strike, not to counter it with force, which would have taken more time than they had, but to physically position themselves between the strike and the evacuation route, absorbing damage that would otherwise have fallen on ships carrying people who could not defend themselves at all. I remember watching this from a distance, unable to reach them in time to help, and feeling something I had not expected to feel watching a battle unfold. Fear, not for myself, but for people I had come to know personally over the preceding months, people who had chosen, in the space of seconds, to place themselves in harm's way for others they had never met. Daniel's voice came over the channel during those critical moments, calm despite what must have been immense pressure, reporting shield integrity dropping steadily as the ships absorbed strike after strike, meant for the evacuation route behind them. I heard Nora's voice as well, coordinating emergency medical response in real time, preparing for losses that, mercifully, in the end, did not come, though the margin by which they were avoided was thin enough that I still find it difficult to think about clearly, even now. The evacuation completed successfully. Every non-combatant along that route survived, protected by ships that had chosen, without hesitation or formal instruction to do so, to place themselves in the path of destruction rather than allow it to reach people who could not protect themselves. The Hollow's remaining forces, having exhausted their last significant defensive effort in an attempt that ultimately failed, surrendered within the hour, unable to mount any further meaningful resistance against a decentralized adaptive force that had proven impossible to counter through conventional means. The Council reconvened 3 days later, and this time there was no significant argument against continuing to build Allied strategy around the principles the humans had introduced. Ves Orelin, the Krath commander who had voiced the strongest doubts before the operation began, was the first to speak, and rather than argue his previous position, he simply acknowledged, plainly and without pride, that he had been wrong to believe unpredictability could not be built on a stable foundation. He said he understood now what that foundation truly was, and that he had watched it hold, unbroken, even when the cost of holding it had nearly been unbearable. In the months that followed, Allied fleets across the war began adopting elements of the decentralized, trust-based coordination the humans had introduced, not as a replacement for their own traditions entirely, but woven carefully into them, adapted to fit each species' particular strengths. I heard, more than once, Allied officers who had never even met a human begin using phrases that had clearly originated from them, referring to difficult, costly decisions as choices made on human time, a phrase that had come to mean choosing what was right over what was merely safe, regardless of the cost involved. I do not believe the humans set out to change how the rest of the galaxy fought its wars. I do not believe that was ever their intention. I believe, based on everything I witnessed during those months, that they simply refused to abandon certain principles regardless of the pressure to do so, and that the rest of us, watching closely enough, began to understand that those principles had been worth adopting all along. The war was not yet over, but something fundamental had shifted, permanently, in how it would be fought from that point forward, and I do not believe any of us who lived through the Hollow ever fully returned to the way we had thought about warfare before. The war ended 11 years after the battle at the Hollow, though calling it an ending feels, even now, like an incomplete description of what actually happened. Wars, I have come to understand, do not simply stop. They wear down slowly, exhausted resistance giving way to negotiation, until one day the fighting quietly ceases, and everyone involved is left to determine what remains of who they were before it began. I am old now, by the standards of my own species, though I understand this would still be considered relatively young by human measures, a fact that used to surprise me and now simply makes me smile whenever I remember it. I no longer command a fleet. I have not commanded one in many years. Instead, I spend my remaining time doing something I never expected to find meaningful, recording the history of a war that changed nearly everything about how the galaxy understands conflict, cooperation, and what it means to fight for something larger than survival alone. I have been asked many times, by historians and young officers alike, to identify the single moment everything changed. I have given this question a great deal of thought over the years, and I no longer believe there was ever a single moment at all. There were many moments, scattered across more than a decade of conflict, each one small on its own, each one building on the last, until the accumulated weight of them reshaped an entire civilization's understanding of what strength truly meant. I think of Nora Finch often, though we have not spoken directly in several years. She retired from active service not long after the war ended, choosing instead to establish a medical training program that now operates across nearly a dozen Allied worlds, teaching a new generation of doctors and combat medics a philosophy she developed over years of holding both roles simultaneously, one that insists no decision, however difficult, should ever be made in complete isolation. I have visited that program twice, and both times I found myself moved nearly to tears, watching young officers from a dozen different species learn, side by side, the same principles I once watched her live out under fire. Daniel Voss continued his work in engineering long after the fighting stopped, though his focus shifted entirely toward rebuilding rather than combat. I am told he led the design team responsible for several of the reconstruction stations now orbiting worlds that were devastated during the war's final years, worlds that, without those stations, might never have recovered the way they eventually did. I spoke with him once during that period, and he told me, with the same quiet seriousness I remembered from aboard Owen's ship, that building something meant to last mattered more to him than any weapon ever had, and that he had spent enough years improving systems designed to end lives that he wanted, for whatever time remained to him, to spend his skill improving systems designed to sustain them instead. Ellie Marsh remained in communications work, though her role expanded far beyond anything either of us could have predicted during those early months. She became, over time, one of the primary architects of the decentralized coordination networks that now connect Allied fleets across dozens of star systems, networks built directly on principles she helped prove effective during the war, principles that trusted individual units to communicate and adapt directly with one another, rather than waiting on distant, centralized command. I still hear her voice occasionally, on training recordings shared with new recruits, patient and warm, teaching young officers the same lessons she once taught a nervous Velen commander during the darkest hours of the Hollow. Lucas Bren, the youngest of them, went on to do something I found particularly fitting, given how curious he had always been about species other than his own. He became a diplomat, one of the first human representatives to serve on the newly restructured Accord Council, a position that placed him directly in rooms filled with commanders and leaders from every species that had fought alongside humanity during the war. I attended several sessions where he spoke, and I noticed, each time, how naturally other species listened to him, not because of any formal authority his position carried, but because he had spent years learning to genuinely understand perspectives different from his own, a skill that proved, in the end, just as valuable during peace as any tactic had been during war. And Owen Hale, I think of him more than any of the others, though perhaps that is simply because I spent the most time in his presence during those difficult years. He remained in active service until the very end of the war, leading operations that grew steadily larger and more complex, as Allied command came to trust the principles he had helped establish. I do not believe he ever fully grew comfortable with that trust, and I remember him telling me once, quietly, during a rare peaceful evening between operations, that the moment a commander stopped feeling the weight of every decision was the moment that commander had become dangerous in a different way, one no less concerning than recklessness itself. He retired shortly after the war ended, choosing to return to a quiet life, away from the kind of attention his role during the conflict had brought him, attention he never seemed entirely comfortable with in the first place. I visited him once, several years later, on a small settlement far from the crowded centers of Allied civilization. We spoke for hours, mostly about small things, the kind of quiet conversation that felt impossible during the years we had known each other under fire. Near the end of that visit, I finally asked him the question I had carried with me since that very first battle above my dying fleet, so many years earlier. I asked him if he had known, back then, that the choices his people made would change how the rest of the galaxy understood warfare itself. He told me no, honestly and without hesitation, the same way he had answered nearly every difficult question I had ever asked him. He said he had not been thinking about legacy at all during those years. He said he had simply been trying to make choices he could live with afterward, and that any change beyond that had never been the goal, only the result of enough people making similar choices, again and again, until those choices became something larger than any single decision ever could have been on its own. I have carried that answer with me for a long time now, and I believe it captures something essential about what truly happened during those years, something more important than any single battle or tactic I have described. The humans did not set out to reshape the galaxy's understanding of strength, sacrifice, or cooperation. They set out, again and again, choice by choice, to be people worth trusting, even when trust was costly, even when it would have been easier not to be. The rest of us, watching closely enough over more than a decade of shared conflict, began to understand that this quiet, consistent choice was itself a kind of strength we had never fully valued before, one built not on overwhelming force or rigid discipline alone, but on a willingness to hold on to certain principles regardless of the cost, and on the trust that grows, slowly and irreversibly, when enough people prove, again and again, that they will not abandon each other when it matters most. I am told by younger officers who never lived through the war itself that the phrase human resolve has become common across nearly every allied species now, used to describe exactly this kind of choice, the decision to hold to what is right, even when everything around you argues for something easier. I did not expect, all those years ago, watching 3 unfamiliar ships form an unconventional wall against overwhelming odds, that I was witnessing the beginning of an idea that would eventually outlive the war itself, carried forward not through monuments or formal history, but through the quiet, ordinary choices of people who never set out to become anything more than what they already were. The galaxy is different now than it was before humanity stepped onto its battlefields. I do not believe this is an exaggeration, though I understand it may sound like one to those who did not witness it directly. Cooperation between species that once fought entirely within their own rigid traditions has become common in ways that would have seemed impossible before the war. Command structures across dozens of fleets now build deliberately toward the kind of decentralized trust the humans first demonstrated at the Hollow. Even the language we use to describe courage and sacrifice has shifted, carrying, in nearly every case I have encountered, some echo of principles humanity brought with them the moment they arrived. I do not know what challenges still wait for this alliance in the years ahead. I have lived long enough to understand that peace, like war, is never truly permanent, and that whatever comes next will likely test everything we have built in ways none of us can fully predict yet. But I find myself, more often than not these days, feeling something I would not have believed possible during those early, desperate hours above my dying fleet. I find myself feeling hope, quiet and steady, not because I believe the future holds no further difficulty, but because I have seen, firsthand, what a handful of people willing to hold on to their principles, even under the worst possible pressure, can eventually mean for an entire galaxy. The moment humans stepped onto that battlefield, so many years ago, their galactic legacy began, not with grand declarations or overwhelming displays of power, but with 3 ships forming an unconventional wall around the wounded, and a voice, calm and certain, asking only where the vulnerable could be found. Everything that followed, every battle, every difficult choice, every principle that reshaped how an entire civilization understands strength, grew outward from that single quiet decision to protect what mattered most, even when protecting it cost everything they had. That, I have come to believe, is the truest legacy any species can leave behind, not the wars they won, but the reasons they chose to fight them in the first place, and the people they refused to become along the way.